Alright, hello guys and welcome back to Within the Good Books. I guess if anyone was following me there, I didn't really hold up to my 2-week promise, but better late than never, so here we are, and today I'm going to be doing a review on Jane Eyre. So I guess just some very general things on probably the reason why it took me longer to finish the book was actually because I didn't terribly enjoy reading it, I guess. I didn't really relate well to the story or to any of the characters. But I do think that afterwards, after studying it, it was a really phenomenal read because there's so much information out there and there's so many people that have read this book and loved it. And to take nothing away from them, just personally wasn't for me, but I'm glad that I joined that conversation and now can talk about the events in the book and how I feel about them. So I guess let's dive right in here. First of all, my favorite part of the book actually was when Mr. Rochester first proposed to Jane and she kind of refused, she accepted the marriage, but she kind of refused to change who she was and she wanted to continue her post as governess for a while, probably to ensure the actuality of his affection towards her. The reason why I really like this part is not necessarily because I 100% agree with it, but just the fact that it's very contrary to what I think that the general person would do. Someone of a lower status would love to kind of make that jump to that high-class society, and especially in that day and age when that's kind of what it was all about, was where you were in society. The reason why I'm not terribly fond of the idea, just as a philosophical view, I guess the reason why I don't generally tend to agree with the idea is because I think the relationships are a bit of give and take. Maybe Mr. Rochester wasn't giving as much as well, but I think Jane being too restrictive to not change herself and focus on individuality as opposed to being a whole in this case might be a reason as to why, especially today, we have a lot of issues with marriage and relationships and like that, and maybe we have it wrong, maybe I have it wrong, but I think that people don't try enough to be a unit as opposed to try to be an individual and just be in a relationship with someone. So my least favorite part of the book, unfortunately, is probably just in general the events that occur, meaning I'm not terribly a big fan of like Gothic Victorian romance. I didn't particularly like how it was a regular book and seemed like a regular time until all these supernatural things occurred every once in a while, and they're perceived as real as opposed to just the figments of someone's imagination. And I thought it was a bit awkward. I don't necessarily appreciate that genre, and it just wasn't for me. So now moving on quickly to my favorite characters. So my first favorite character was actually Helen Burns. And the reason why I really appreciated Helen Burns was kind of the reason why I appreciated that how Jane refused to, jump to that higher class very quickly, is because it is in fact that her ideas were irregular in the sense that most people, for instance, when she was punished by her teacher, would have taken it out as if the teacher had some sort of vendetta for them. But she took it as an example of how she could better herself within that situation, and that the teacher only wants kind of what's best for her. And I mean, to take that with a grain of salt, there is some issues when you go too far, obviously. But in this scenario, I just really liked it because it seemed that she had a unique perspective. And as I said before, that is something that I really appreciate in this book. Also, I mean, if you've read up on the Brontë sisters at all, you're quite aware that Helen Burns is actually a symbol of Jane's older sister, who actually died, and as well a boarding school where they had very poor conditions and stuff. So when Helen had this very mature point of view, I thought that it was a bit bizarre when I was reading the book, and later on when I studied it. I think that it's because when you're younger and you see someone maybe 2 years older, and you think of them as this kind of like idealistic maturity and way of thinking that is so much greater than, and in the instance of Helen Burns, she's definitely almost too mature for her age, and I think that that's the reason why Charlotte Brontë wrote it in this fashion. My next favorite character is Jane Eyre, and I mean, it would be a lot difficult to read the book if I didn't appreciate her whatsoever, and I really did. Jane is a symbol of not being defined by social class, meaning that she's very educated and she has many skills that are only associated usually with the higher class, and yet she's able to do these things while being in the lower class. I think that's fantastic. And the other thing too is I really appreciate, as I said before, Jane's different way of thinking. Throughout the book it's quite clear that very simple things make her happy, and that might be due to her isolated state throughout her life, but just someone with that genuine perspective, I think, is I think is fantastic. So now moving on to my least favorite characters. So my first least favorite character is actually Miss Reed. And I mean, I'm sure she's not very popular with any of people who have read Jane Eyre, but the reason why I actually don't like Miss Reed is not necessarily because she had some sort of hate for Jane, but rather that she had some sort of bizarre hate for Jane, in the sense that I can understand not liking someone, but for instance, when Jane's uncle wanted to adopt her that one time, and Miss Reed had said that she had died at Logwood in order for it not to occur. I thought it was bizarre, because if Jane had in fact been adopted by her uncle, then Miss Reed would have never had to deal with Jane ever again. And in that sense, I don't quite understand why she's restricting Jane's happiness in order for some sort of bizarre occurrence with her. I mean, I think there's probably something more there, I guess, that if I read it again, I'd look in further, that maybe she has a reason to desire for Jane to be unhappy, but I just don't like people who like that, who kind of want to see the world burn. And my next least favorite character is actually probably going to disappoint a lot of people, but it's actually Mr. Rochester, and I really didn't relate well to him. I just feel like he was kind of one of those half good guys, meaning that he does something for the general good, but he does it in a sense that so he can say that he's a good guy. For instance, his marriage with Bertha, he could have easily stored her away somewhere and nobody would have ever heard about him, but he keeps her close. He keeps her close, and he keeps her also in somewhat of a good situation, better than she would have, for instance. But the other part that's a bit weird is that if he truly was that loyal and very, I guess, ethically correct guy, he would have accepted this mistake that he'd made with this marriage with Bertha and kind of not went and pursued other women in order to marry. I just think that that's kind of what he does often. The other thing too is with Adele. He takes her in and he treats her well, and Adele gets a good education, all of that. So many fantastic things, but he really doesn't treat Adele with that genuine love and stuff that you think that someone who is taking in this child because he cares for her, in the sense that he kind of realizing his mistakes, doesn't make the full jump, I guess is what I'm trying to say. The other part too, I mean, obviously there's some speculation as to if Adele is actually his child or not, which I can completely understand, but I find that genuinity of him is just not there. Moving on quickly to my favorite quotations of the book. I have 3 of them, and I guess I'll say them in chronological order, because I guess why not? First one was actually when Mr. Brocklehurst comes to see Jane for the first time to talk to Miss Reed about possibly Jane Eyre coming to Logwood. Here's the quote right here. "No sight so sad of a naughty child," he began, "especially a naughty little girl. Do you know where the wicked go after death? They go to hell," was my ready and orthodox answer. And what is hell? Can you tell me that? "A pit full of fire. And what should you like to fall into that pit and go burning there forever? No, sir. What must you do to avoid it?" I deliberated a moment. My answer, when it did come, was objectionable. "I must keep in good health and not die." That's just one of my favorites, because I think it's clever, I think it's funny. I think that it really shows, I guess, Jane's defiance to authority and to class and stuff very early on. And I also really appreciate when, very young minds kind of say these very honest, unfiltered thoughts. I feel like as people get older, they get a lot better at dealing with certain situations. In a sense, they lose a bit of themselves. So my next favorite quote is actually when Jane finally accepts to marry Mr. Rochester for the second time, and it's a really good example once more of Jane's genuine kind of humor or bizarre social etiquette, I guess. So it starts off with Mr. Rochester asking, "Am I hideous, Jane?" And she answers, "Very, sir, you always were, you know." So again, this is bizarre, and I actually laughed out loud when I read that part. It's just the way Jane is, she feels like it's more important to be honest in that situation than comfort Mr. Rochester, who had just been disfigured and lost his sight and stuff. But it works well, because that's why, at least in the book, it's said that Mr. Rochester really likes Jane. The last quote actually was, the classic, "Reader, I married him." And the reason why this was actually my favorite is not really because it's pretty or whatever, but because it's the first sentence of the last chapter of the book. And I think that is very important, because it's very important to realize again that you are reading a fictional autobiography. And I'll talk about that a little bit later in the book, but I just liked that almost style of writing, in the sense that there's this very blunt sentence at the beginning of a chapter to stress the importance of the actual nature of the book. So one thing I wanted to include in my other videos, and I seem to forget all the time, was my opinion on the ending of the book. So personally, I didn't really like the ending of the book, and the reason why I didn't like it was because I felt like a lot of things just kind of snowballed into effect in order for Mr. Rochester and Jane to get together and get married. Like if you read the last 150 pages of the book, there's all this stuff occurred. Like Jane got her fortune, Bertha set the house on fire, Mr. Rochester was disfigured, so Jane felt somewhat comfortable in being in a relationship with him now, being the same class, and her being in a position of power in the relationship, being able that he kind of needed her as opposed to her needing him. I just feel like it was a bit bizarre. And I mean, towards the end of the book too, when Mr. Rochester, it hints in the last few pages, is making a recovery in terms of his sight and his strength. Personally, I feel like it's just sort of trying to make this a fairy tale ending, which is a bit bizarre because of this nature of this gothic book, right? I feel like I would almost feel more comfortable if Mr. Rochester had maybe died and Jane had realized that her pride had restricted her from actually being with this man that she loved, and then sometimes you have to make exceptions to your rules. But in this case, it seemed like a fairy tale ending to me. I know I read some stuff about feminism and how it's when Jane possibly submitted to Mr. Rochester, he kind of started regaining his strength, and that's a symbolism of his dominance within the relationship. I mean, I'm not very well educated in that field, so I'm not going to comment, but from my perspective, I thought it was some sort of fairy tale ending. I really did not enjoy it. So now just some general discussions. I like to come up with something unique with every book, and I think with this book, it's very, very important to realize that you are reading a fictional autobiography. Charlotte Brontë does some clever things within this book. I mean, for instance, it even says an autobiography at the beginning of the book, which you know clearly isn't true because it's a fictional novel. And when she addresses the reader throughout the book, I think that's a very clever way of reminding what's going on as well, because I would have definitely forgotten that if I didn't have these constant kind of dialogue with the reader. I mean, the thing that I think that would be fun to read this book again, and I think that the reason why Charlotte Brontë stresses so hard that it is an autobiography is actually the fact that some of these events are very biased in the sense of the way that they are described, or some events are left out, and it's supposed to be sort of puzzle where you go back and you find all these areas which don't necessarily make sense with other things that go on in the book. And I just think that that's an exciting moment, and I kind of only realized this towards the end, that even if you think about it, if you're writing an autobiography, the events of which she was at Logwood when she was young, or when she was with Miss Reed early on, those would be such distant memories, and to think about a time when you don't even have any pictures or anything to remind yourself of those times, it could very easily, those memories, be very, very flawed. And I think that would be a fun assignment, I guess, or a fun expedition to go back and find these instances where it maybe wasn't perfect, and maybe your mind can kind of wander as to what could have actually happened in that situation. Anyways, thank you for your time again. My next book I'm reading is Brave New World. I'm not going to make a promise on the 2 weeks because I guess we know what happened last time. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.